The winter of 1402 descended upon the English countryside with a silence that seemed to hold its breath, and through that silence came a woman no one expected to see again. She stood at the iron gates of Ashworth Castle, her gloved hand resting against the cold metal, as if testing whether the bars would burn her. The February wind pulled at her dark woolen cloak, at the modest hood drawn carefully over hair the color of autumn chestnuts, and she did not move. Beyond those gates, the frozen path wound through bare orchards toward a fortress that rose against the pewter sky like a monument to inherited power, all gray stone and narrow windows and towers that had witnessed the rise and fall of 3 generations of nobility. Eleanor Whitmore had walked this path before. She had walked it in worn leather shoes, carrying letters of recommendation folded in her kirtle pocket, her heart full of the quiet hope that comes to young women who believe education and virtue might open doors that birth had closed. She had walked it in silk slippers, too, her arm linked through his, her breath caught somewhere between disbelief and joy as he had whispered words she had been foolish enough to trust. She had fled from it in darkness, with nothing but the clothes she wore and the fracture in her chest where her heart had been. Now she returned. The gatekeeper's lodge showed no light, the old man likely warming himself by some fire deep within the castle walls. Eleanor pressed her palm flat against the gate and pushed, expecting resistance, but the iron swung inward with a groan of frozen hinges that echoed across the empty courtyard. No one stopped her. Perhaps the household had grown careless in her absence. Perhaps they had forgotten that a woman once dismissed did not always stay dismissed. She began to walk. Her boots crunched against the frost-hardened earth with each step, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. To her left, the gardens had surrendered entirely to winter. Rose bushes cut back to thorny stumps, the stone fountains silent and dry, wooden benches standing empty where she had once sat with the household's children, teaching them to read from illuminated manuscripts she had borrowed from the castle's modest library. She did not look at those benches. She did not look at the chapel windows either, though she felt them watching her like dark eyes remembering prayers she had once believed would be answered. Instead, Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the main entrance, where the great oak doors stood closed beneath a portico carved with the Ashworth coat of arms, a falcon rising against a field of stars, the Latin motto carved beneath, Per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars. The Ashworths had always believed themselves destined for greatness, had collected titles and lands and beautiful things from across the realm to demonstrate their ascent. She had been one of those collected things once. A governess with a gentle voice and a gift for making difficult children love their lessons, a curiosity, a diversion, a mistake. She climbed the stone steps, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Her reflection appeared in the polished brass of the door ring, a woman of 24 with shadows beneath her eyes and a set to her jaw that had not been there before. She looked older. She felt older. The past 8 months had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with the knowledge she now carried. Eleanor lifted the heavy ring and let it fall against the oak. The sound rang through the silence like a bell tolling the end of something. She waited. One hand pressed unconsciously to her abdomen, where beneath the careful draping of her cloak, the truth of her return had begun to make itself visible. Footsteps approached from within. The door swung open. A steward she did not recognize stood in the entrance hall, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to confusion as he took in her appearance. She was dressed respectably but not finely. Her cloak was good wool but showed the wear of hard travel. Her face belonged neither to the noble ladies who arrived in carriages, nor to the servants who knew to use the kitchen entrance. "May I help you, mistress?" Eleanor drew a breath. The air inside smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and something else. The particular scent of old wealth, of generations of certainty, of tapestries that had hung on these walls since before her grandmother was born. She had forgotten how oppressive that scent could be. "I am here to see Lord James Ashworth," she said. Her voice did not waver. She had practiced this moment in her rented room above a tavern in York, speaking to the cracked glass above the washstand, refusing to let her words tremble. "Please inform him that Mistress Eleanor Whitmore has returned." The steward's face changed. Recognition flickered there, not of her specifically, but of her name, of the whispers that must still cling to it in this house like smoke to wool. His professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been shock or might have been pity. Mistress Whitmore, he repeated carefully. I am afraid his lordship is not receiving visitors this day. He will receive me. Mistress, I must insist. Tell him. Eleanor stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a certainty that made the steward retreat a half-step despite himself. Tell him that I carry news he will wish to hear. Tell him that silence is no longer possible. Tell him— She paused, feeling the weight of what she was about to say. Tell him that some dismissals cannot be made permanent. The steward stared at her. Behind him, the great hall stretched into shadows, all stone floors and hanging tapestries and portraits of Ashworth ancestors who had never, in their accumulated generations, faced a woman who refused to disappear quietly. Wait here, he said finally. I shall inquire. The door did not close in her face. That small courtesy felt like a victory. Eleanor stood beneath the portico and listened to the steward's footsteps fade into the depths of the castle. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distant sound of ravens calling from the tower. She had loved that sound once, had stood at the window of her small chamber in the servants' wing, and listened to the birds, and imagined that their cries contained messages from a world beyond these walls, a world where a woman's worth was not measured by her birth. How young she had been, how devastatingly, dangerously young. She closed her eyes and let herself remember. The Ashworth household had engaged her services in the spring of 1401, when the apple trees in the orchard were heavy with blossoms and the world seemed full of second chances. She had come with excellent letters from a convent school in Lincolnshire, where she had taught the daughters of merchants and minor gentry, and she had been grateful, genuinely, humbly grateful, for the position. Governess to the two youngest Ashworth children was a respectable post, well compensated by the standards of her station, and the family's reputation suggested stability and propriety. What the reputation had not suggested was James. James Ashworth, eldest son of the house, heir to a dukedom and all the expectations that accompanied such an inheritance. He had been 27 when she arrived, restless and dissatisfied in ways she had not understood at first. He spent too much time in the library when he should have been at court attending to political alliances. He asked too many questions about the books she used in her lessons, about her opinions on philosophy and theology and the education of women. He looked at her too long when he thought she was not watching. And she, God help her, she had looked back. The affair, if it could be called such, had been brief. 3 months of stolen conversations in the library, of accidental touches that ceased being accidental, of his hand finding hers in the darkness of the rose garden while the household slept. He had spoken of love. He had spoken of a future that existed somewhere beyond the castle walls and feudal expectations, a future where a man might choose his own heart instead of his family's ambitions. She had believed him because she had wanted to believe, because she was lonely and he was kind, and the feeling between them had seemed like fate itself, impossible to resist. Then his mother had discovered the truth. Lady Margaret Ashworth, Dowager Duchess, matriarch of the family, guardian of its reputation, architect of its alliances. She had found the letters Eleanor had foolishly saved, letters that spoke of James's feelings in his own hand, letters that could have destroyed his betrothal to Lady Charlotte Sinclair, daughter of the Earl of Westmore, the union that would merge two powerful houses and secure the Ashworth influence at court for another generation. The confrontation had been swift and brutal. Not violent, Lady Margaret was too refined for violence, but thorough. Eleanor had been informed that she was unworthy of the Ashworth name, that her employment was terminated immediately, that any attempt to contact James or reveal the nature of their relationship would be met with accusations of witchcraft and social ruin, that she should be grateful in truth for the opportunity to disappear quietly instead of being exposed as a scheming temptress who had bewitched her employer's son. Eleanor had tried to argue. She had tried to explain that she had not schemed, had not tempted, had merely loved and been loved in return. But her words had fallen on stone floors and stone faces, and James had not appeared. James had been sent to London on the king's business that very morning, and by the time he returned, she had been erased from the household as thoroughly as if she had never existed at all. She had waited for him to find her. For weeks, then months, she had waited in her rented room in York, working as a seamstress for a tailor who asked no questions, expecting every knock at the door to be him, expecting a letter or a messenger or some sign that he had not abandoned her as completely as his mother had claimed. But no word came. No explanation, no acknowledgement that what they had shared had been real. And then, 2 months after her dismissal, she had discovered that their love had left a mark that no amount of silence could erase. The steward's footsteps returned, pulling Eleanor from her memories. She opened her eyes and straightened her spine, preparing herself for whatever would come next. Mistress Whitmore. The steward's voice was carefully neutral, his face betraying nothing. Lord Ashworth will see you. Please follow me. Eleanor stepped across the threshold of Ashworth Castle for the second time in her life. The great hall had not changed. The same tapestries depicting hunting scenes and biblical stories hung from the walls. The same banners bearing the falcon and stars swayed gently in the draught from the high windows. The same rush-covered floor stretched toward the same carved staircase that led to the family's private chambers. But she had changed. She was no longer the hopeful governess with letters of recommendation in her pocket. She was a woman with evidence that could not be dismissed. The steward led her not to the formal receiving chamber where Lady Margaret entertained visitors of uncertain status, but to the library, the same library where she and James had first spoken of something other than lesson plans, where he had read to her from Chaucer, and she had countered with passages from Christine de Pizan, and they had discovered in the dangerous space between literature and silence that they understood each other in ways that had nothing to do with station or propriety. The steward opened the heavy oak door and stepped aside. Mistress Whitmore, he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the vaulted chamber. Eleanor walked into the library. He was standing by the window. 8 months had changed him too. His dark hair showed new threads of gray at the temples, though he was not yet 30, and there were lines around his eyes that she did not remember. He had lost weight. His velvet doublet hung slightly loose at the shoulders, as if the body beneath it had diminished. When he turned to face her, his expression was not the carefully controlled mask she had expected, but something rawer, something that looked almost like desperation meeting relief. Eleanor. Her name in his voice sounded like a prayer and a wound at once. I thought... He stopped, swallowed, began again. They told me you had gone, that you had taken silver and fled, that you wanted nothing more to do with... They lied. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, sending ripples outward through the dusty air. James's face changed, shifted, as understanding began to dawn. I took nothing, Eleanor continued. Her voice remained steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. I was given 3 hours to gather my belongings and was escorted from the castle by your mother's men-at-arms. I was told that any attempt to contact you would result in my destruction, accusations of witchcraft, imprisonment, perhaps death. I waited in York for 8 months, James. 8 months working as a seamstress, waiting for some word from you that never came. I wrote. His voice cracked like ice breaking on a winter pond. Eleanor, I wrote a dozen letters. I sent them to every inn and lodging house I could discover. They all came back unopened, and when I finally traced you to York, the landlord said you had moved without leaving word of your destination. I moved because I could no longer afford the rent. She took a step toward him, then another, closing the distance that felt like an ocean. And because I discovered something that made remaining in one place too dangerous. James's eyes dropped to her midsection, to the gentle swelling that her cloak could no longer entirely conceal. For a long moment he did not speak. When he did, his voice was barely above a whisper. Is it yours? Eleanor placed her hand protectively over her abdomen, over the child that had grown there through months of fear and poverty and desperate hope. The babe will come in spring. I returned because I refused to let our child be born in secrecy and shame, as though we had done something wicked by loving each other. I returned because you deserve to know the truth, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. James crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 strides. His hands reached for her shoulders, stopped, hovered in the air as if afraid that touching her would cause her to dissolve like morning mist. Eleanor. His voice broke on her name like waves on rocks. I have spent 8 months believing you had abandoned me, that everything between us had been a lie, a scheme for advancement. My mother told me... He stopped, and something dark flickered across his features like a shadow passing over the sun. My mother told me many things, and I was fool enough to believe them because the alternative was accepting that I had failed you completely. You did not fail me. You were deceived. We both were. I should have fought harder. I should have refused to leave for London that morning, should have demanded to speak with you before— James. Eleanor reached up and touched his face. The first physical contact between them since the night they had said farewell in the garden, when neither of them had known it was farewell. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, roughened slightly by a beard he had not worn before, and she felt him tremble like a man holding back a flood. What matters now is what happens next. Your mother will not accept this. Your betrothal to Lady Charlotte will be destroyed by the scandal. Your family's position at court, your inheritance, everything you have been raised to protect, all of it will be threatened by what I carry. I do not care. You should care. I need you to understand what you are choosing. I understood the moment you walked through that door. James covered her hand with his own, pressing it against his cheek as if drawing warmth from a fire. I chose you 18 months ago, Eleanor. I chose you when I asked you to walk with me in the garden, when I told you things I had never spoken to another soul, when I held you in the darkness and promised you a future I was too cowardly to build. I have spent 8 months believing I had lost that choice forever. Now you are telling me I have a second chance to be the man I should have been. His voice steadied, filled with something that sounded like iron beneath velvet. Let my mother oppose it. Let the court whisper. Let the Sinclair alliance collapse. I will not lose you again. Eleanor searched his face for doubt and found none. Whatever weakness had allowed him to be separated from her before seemed to have burned away in the months of grief and regret, leaving behind something harder and more certain, like steel forged in fire. This will not be easy, she said softly. There will be consequences I cannot protect you from. Then we shall face them together. She had imagined this moment so many times during her months of waiting, imagined it going wrong in a dozen different ways, imagined rejection and denial and cold legal proceedings. She had not imagined this. James pulling her into his arms as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of shadows, his lips against her hair, his voice repeating her name like a prayer against the darkness. She had not imagined that returning home could feel like this. The library door opened with a sound like thunder. James! Lady Margaret Ashworth's voice cut through the moment like a blade drawn from its sheath. Eleanor and James separated, not quickly, not guiltily, but with the deliberate calm of two people who knew they were being tested and refused to fail. Lady Margaret stood in the doorway, magnificent in deep burgundy velvet, her silver hair arranged beneath the elaborate headdress that spoke of wealth and status, her face showing nothing of the fury that must be burning beneath the surface like coals beneath ash. Behind her, two servants hovered uncertainly, as if unsure whether they were about to witness a scene that would require their intervention. I was informed, Lady Margaret said, each word precise as a needle, that an unwanted visitor had forced her way into the castle. I see the servants were not exaggerating. Mistress Whitmore is not unwanted. James moved to stand beside Eleanor, his shoulder brushing hers in a gesture of solidarity that said more than words. She is welcome in this house for as long as she chooses to remain. Lady Margaret's eyes traveled slowly from her son's face to Eleanor's midsection, where the evidence of their relationship was becoming impossible to ignore beneath the heavy wool of her cloak. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes went cold as winter ice. I see. 2 words, carrying the weight of understanding and contempt. So the fortune hunter returns with proof of her scheme. How entirely predictable. Eleanor is not— James, you will be silent. Lady Margaret stepped into the library and closed the door behind her, leaving the servants on the other side. Her composure was perfect, her voice steady as stone, but Eleanor recognized the controlled fury of a woman whose carefully constructed plans were threatening to collapse like a castle built on sand. You will be silent while I speak to this person, and then you will make a decision about whether you wish to remain a member of this family. There is no decision to make. There is always a decision. Lady Margaret turned her attention to Eleanor with the focused intensity of a hawk examining its prey. Mistress Whitmore, you have returned to Ashworth carrying what you claim is my son's child. You have entered this castle without invitation, disrupted my household, and presumably expect some form of compensation for your troubles." "I expect nothing," Eleanor replied, her voice calm despite the pounding of her heart. "I came to inform James of the truth. What happens next is between him and me." "What happens next?" Lady Margaret smiled, a thin, cold expression that did not reach her eyes, like frost on glass. "Allow me to explain what happens next. My son is betrothed to Lady Charlotte Sinclair. The wedding is arranged for Eastertide. The union will merge two of the most powerful families in the realm and secure the Ashworth position at court for generations to come. Against this, against everything our family has built over 5 generations, you offer what? A child conceived in scandal, a reputation already destroyed, and the laughable fantasy that James will abandon his duties for a governess with delusions of elevation." "Mother." James's voice was low and dangerous, like the growl of a wolf before it strikes. "You will not speak to her thus. I will speak to her however I choose, because I am attempting to save you from yourself." Lady Margaret did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her authority filled the chamber like cold water, seeping into every corner, extinguishing warmth. "The Sinclair betrothal cannot be broken without catastrophic consequences. Our alliances at court depend upon it. Your father's legacy depends upon it. Would you have him turn in his grave knowing his heir threw away everything for a woman who spread her legs in exchange for the fantasy of becoming someone she could never be?" Eleanor felt James tense beside her, felt his fury building toward an explosion that would only make things worse. She placed her hand on his arm, a gentle pressure, a request for restraint, a reminder that this battle would not be won through anger. "My lady," she said quietly, her voice steady as still water, "I understand that you hate me. I understand that everything I represent threatens the life you have built for your son. But I am not leaving, and I am not lying, and no amount of cruelty will change the truth that I carry your grandchild." She met Lady Margaret's cold gaze without flinching, without looking away. "You may destroy my reputation. You may spread whatever stories you wish. But you cannot erase this child's existence, and you cannot erase the fact that James knows the truth now. Whatever he decides with full knowledge, not the lies you told him 8 months ago." Lady Margaret's face remained impassive as carved marble, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a reluctant reassessment of an opponent she had thought easily defeated. She had expected the governess to be intimidated. She had expected tears, pleading, easy vulnerability to exploit. What she found instead was a woman who had spent 8 months hardening herself against exactly this moment, tempering her spirit like a blade in the forge of hardship. "You are more resilient than I anticipated," Lady Margaret acknowledged, her voice carrying a note of grudging respect beneath the contempt. "That does not change the mathematics of this situation. Society will never accept you. The Earl of Westmore will destroy our position at court if the betrothal is broken, and my son," she turned to James with an expression of weary disappointment, "my son will eventually come to resent you for everything you have cost him." "That is my choice to make," James said firmly, "not yours." "Is it?" Lady Margaret moved toward the door, her velvet skirts whispering against the rush-covered floor like secrets being exchanged. "Very well, make your choice, but understand the consequences clearly. If you pursue this attachment, you will do so without the Ashworth name, without the Ashworth lands, and without any support from this family. I will not permit the scandal to destroy everything your father and grandfather built." She paused with her hand on the iron ring that served as a door handle. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. I suggest you think very carefully about what you are willing to sacrifice." The door closed behind her with a sound like the sealing of a tomb. James exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping as the tension of the confrontation released like a bowstring after the arrow has flown. When he turned to Eleanor, his face held none of the doubt his mother had predicted, only a fierce, settled determination that reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. "She believes that will change my mind." "Will it? Did you not hear what I said?" He took her hands in his, holding them as if they were precious relics, sacred objects to be protected at all costs. "I chose you, Eleanor. I choose you now. I will choose you tomorrow morning, and every morning after until death takes me. Whatever fortune I lose, whatever name I forfeit, whatever position I surrender, none of it matters if it costs me you." He glanced down at her abdomen, at the slight curve that spoke of new life. "If it cost me both of you." Eleanor felt the tears she had been fighting finally escape, tracing warm paths down her cold cheeks, not tears of sadness, but of something closer to relief, the release of tension she had carried for months like a stone in her chest. She had prepared herself for rejection. She had steeled herself against the possibility that James would choose safety over love, legacy over truth. She had not prepared herself for this, for the reality of being believed, defended, chosen. "We should leave tonight," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "Before your mother can make things more difficult. I have coin enough for passage to the continent. We could start anew in France in—" "No." James shook his head firmly, his jaw set with determination. "We will not flee. Fleeing is what my mother expects, what she desires. If we leave in the night like thieves, we confirm every story she has told about you, every accusation she has made. Instead—" He drew a breath, settling into the decision like a knight settling into armor before battle. "Instead, we remain. We face whatever comes. We let English society see us together and draw their own conclusions, and we find a way to build our future here, on our own terms, in the very place where they attempted to destroy us." It was a bold strategy, possibly a foolish one. But Eleanor looked at the man before her, at the steadiness in his dark eyes, at the strength in his jaw, at the way he held her hands as though he would never release them. And she found herself believing that they might actually survive this. "Together, then," she said. "Together." Outside the library windows, the winter sun was beginning to set, painting the gray sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed to promise warmth despite the cold. Somewhere in the castle, Lady Margaret Ashworth was already planning her next move, marshalling her forces for the battle to come. Somewhere in the realm, Lady Charlotte Sinclair remained unaware that her betrothal was about to crumble like dry leaves in autumn wind. Somewhere across the sea, kings and nobles rose and fell on decisions made by men who believed that power could control everything, including love. But in the library of Ashworth Castle, surrounded by books that had witnessed centuries of human folly and wisdom, two people stood at the beginning of something that would change everything. Their hands intertwined, their futures uncertain, their hearts finally aligned after months of separation and deception. Eleanor Whitmore had returned, and this time, she would not be cast aside. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These stories of love and resilience, of women who refuse to be silenced and men who learn to choose courage over comfort, they are waiting for you, week after week. Subscribe now and let yourself be carried into worlds where dignity always triumphs in the end. The night passed in restless intervals of sleep and waking, and when morning came to Ashworth Castle, it arrived gray and heavy with the promise of snow. James Ashworth stood at the window of his private chamber, watching clouds gather over the distant hills like an army massing for siege. He had not slept well, had barely slept at all, but the exhaustion he felt had nothing to do with the hours and everything to do with the weight of decisions that pressed against his chest like chainmail. His mother's ultimatum echoed through his mind. The Ashworth name, the Ashworth lands, severed like diseased limbs if he chose Eleanor. It should have terrified him. Perhaps it would have, 8 months ago, before he had learned what it meant to lose something more precious than titles or estates. Before he had spent night after night in this very chamber, staring at the canopy above his bed, believing that the woman he loved had abandoned him without explanation, without farewell. Those had been the darkest months of his existence. Not because of the betrothal to Charlotte, which he had accepted with the numb compliance of a man who no longer cared what happened to him. Not because of his mother's satisfaction, or the court's approval, or the society columns that praised his excellent match. The darkness had come from within, from the gnawing conviction that he had been deceived, that Eleanor's love had been nothing more than calculated ambition, that everything he had believed about her had been a carefully constructed illusion designed to ensnare him. He had tried to hate her. God's wounds, how he had tried. He had told himself that the heartache would fade, that time and distance and the steady distractions of duty would eventually erase the memory of her face, her voice, the way she had looked at him in the garden as though he were the only real thing in a world made of pretense and performance. He had repeated his mother's accusations like a monk reciting prayers, fortune hunter, schemer, temptress. He had forced himself to believe that the letters Eleanor had never answered were proof of her guilt, her indifference, her relief at escaping a relationship that had served its purpose. But the belief had never quite taken hold. Some stubborn part of him had continued to whisper that he was missing something essential, that the woman he had known, the woman who wept over Dante's Beatrice, who taught his young siblings with such patient devotion, who had trembled in his arms with an innocence that could not have been counterfeited. That woman could not have been entirely fiction. That woman had been real. He had felt it in his bones, in his blood, in the deepest chambers of his heart. And now, standing at the window while the winter clouds gathered, he understood why his doubts had never fully disappeared. His mother had lied. The realization had struck him like a lance the moment Eleanor spoke her piece in the library, not with anger or accusation, but with the quiet precision of a woman who had nothing left to lose and nothing to hide. She had not begged, had not pleaded, had not offered excuses or recriminations. She had simply stated the facts, the dismissal, the threats, the months of waiting in York, the child she carried, and in that statement James had heard the truth that his mother's careful narrative had obscured behind layers of manipulation and deceit. Eleanor had not betrayed him. He had been deceived into betraying her. The guilt of it was almost unbearable, a weight that pressed upon his soul like the sins of a lifetime confessed all at once. For 8 months, she had waited in poverty while he had wallowed in self-pity. She had sewn garments for merchants' wives while he had attended tournaments and banquets and betrothal celebrations that commemorated a marriage he did not want. She had faced the terror of pregnancy alone, the sickness, the fear, the social devastation that awaited an unwed mother in their unforgiving society. While he had allowed himself to be convinced that she had never loved him at all, he should have searched harder, should have refused to accept his mother's explanations, should have recognized that the woman he loved would never simply disappear without a word unless someone had prevented her. But he had not. He had been weak and confused and ultimately complicit in his own heartbreak. The shame of it burned in his chest like hot iron. A knock at the chamber door interrupted his self-recrimination. James turned as his manservant Thomas entered with the careful deference of a servant who knows his master is troubled. "Your lady mother has requested your presence in the solar, my lord, at your earliest convenience." James's jaw tightened. "And Mistress Whitmore? Has she been disturbed?" "Mistress Whitmore was moved to the Blue Chamber last night, as you instructed. The maidservant reports that she slept poorly but has broken her fast in her room." Thomas paused, his professional mask slipping slightly to reveal the man beneath. "My lord, if I may speak freely." "You may. You have earned that right through years of loyal service. The household is uncertain. Lady Margaret has given instructions that Mistress Whitmore is to be treated as an unwelcome guest, civil service but cold. However, several of the servants remember Mistress Whitmore from her time as governess, and their memories are favorable." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but something in his tone suggested sympathy, even solidarity. "They wish to know which instructions to follow." James was silent for a long moment, considering the implications. The servants remembered Eleanor. Of course they did. She had been kind to them in ways that went beyond mere professional courtesy, remembering their names, asking after their families, treating them as human beings rather than animated furniture designed for the convenience of their betters. His mother's cruelty toward her would have seemed strange to them, inexplicable. And now they were caught between loyalty to the household and memory of a woman who had once been one of their own. "Tell them," James said finally, his voice steady with decision, "that Mistress Whitmore is to be treated as an honored guest, that any instructions to the contrary are countermanded by my authority, and that if my mother objects, they are to direct her complaints to me." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. "Very good, my lord." "And Thomas," James caught the servant's gaze and held it, "what happens in the coming days may change everything about this household, about this family. I cannot promise that your position will remain secure, or that choosing to follow my instructions over my mother's will not carry consequences. If you wish to maintain neutrality in this conflict, I shall understand." For a moment, Thomas's professional mask dissolved entirely, revealing something that looked almost like respect, and perhaps something more, something like the loyalty that is earned rather than commanded. "My lord, I have served this family for 15 years. I have witnessed many things I was expected to ignore and forgotten many things I was instructed never to have seen. But I have also watched you grow from a boy into a man, and I know the difference between weakness and strength, between cowardice and courage." He straightened his shoulders, standing taller than his station typically permitted. "If you are choosing courage, my lord, then I choose to stand with you." It was a small declaration, a manservant pledging loyalty to an heir who might soon have nothing to offer. But in that moment, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable, the first ray of light penetrating a darkness that had lasted too long. "Thank you, Thomas." "My lord." The servant bowed and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. James dressed with care, choosing garments that projected confidence rather than wealth. A dark blue doublet of good wool, simply cut, without the elaborate embroidery his mother favored for family confrontations. He wanted to appear as a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed, not a boy playing at rebellion against parental authority. The solar, when he reached it, was arranged like a stage prepared for a play whose ending had already been determined. His mother sat in the high-backed chair she always claimed for important conversations, her position angled to catch the gray light from the window and cast anyone opposite her in shadow. Beside her, in a chair that had been brought in for the occasion, sat a man James had not expected to see. Father Benedict, the family's chaplain, his weathered face arranged in an expression of pastoral concern that did not quite conceal the calculation beneath. Between them, on the small table that held refreshments neither had touched, lay a single document, its seal broken, its contents visible to anyone who cared to read. "Sit down, James." His mother's voice carried the same controlled authority as the night before, but something in her posture suggested exhaustion, as though the hours of planning had taken their toll on her carefully maintained composure. "We have matters to discuss." James sat. He did not take the shadowed chair his mother had prepared for him, but moved a different seat into the light, positioning himself as an equal, rather than a supplicant before judgment. The small act of defiance was not lost on either observer. "Father Benedict," James acknowledged the priest with a nod that stopped well short of warmth. "I had not expected to see you this morning. Your lady mother requested my presence." The chaplain's voice was smooth as oil on water. She felt that spiritual guidance might be beneficial given the circumstances. "Indeed." James turned his attention to his mother. "And what circumstances would those be?" Lady Margaret's smile was thin as a blade. "The circumstances of your soul's peril, my son. Father Benedict has agreed to hear your confession and provide counsel regarding your unfortunate entanglement with the Whitmore woman." "There is no entanglement. There is love, and there is a child, and there is a future I intend to build with the woman who carries both." "Love." Lady Margaret pronounced the word as though it were a disease, a contagion to be quarantined and eliminated. "You speak of love as though it were something that matters. Love does not secure alliances, James. Love does not maintain our position at court, or protect our lands from rivals who would see us diminished. Love is a weakness that ambitious women exploit and foolish men surrender to, and I will not watch my only son destroy everything his ancestors built in pursuit of such a fleeting emotion. And yet you married my father." James kept his voice level, though anger burned beneath the surface like embers waiting for wind. "Were you entirely indifferent to him? Was there no love in that union at all?" Something flickered across Lady Margaret's face. Pain, perhaps, or the memory of pain long buried beneath duty and disappointment. "I loved your father," she admitted, her voice dropping to something almost human. "And that love taught me exactly how much it costs, how much it takes, how little it gives in return. Your father died when you were 12 years old, James. He died and left me alone with 2 children to raise and an estate to manage, and 1,000 vultures circling, waiting to see if a woman could hold together what a man had built." Her eyes hardened again, emotion retreating behind walls rebuilt. I learned that love is a luxury the powerful cannot afford. I learned that sentiment is weakness, and weakness invites destruction. So you would have me marry a woman I do not love, father children I will not cherish, and spend my remaining years performing the role of devoted husband, while my heart remains with another? James shook his head slowly. That is not protection, Mother. That is a different kind of destruction. Slower, perhaps, but no less complete. It is survival. Lady Margaret's voice snapped like a whip. It is doing what must be done for the sake of those who depend upon us. The servants who work these lands, the tenants who farm them, the vassals who owe us loyalty, they all require stability, continuity, the assurance that the Ashworth name will continue to mean something in this realm. Your happiness is not more important than their security. And Eleanor's happiness? The happiness of my child? Your bastard child. The words were deliberately cruel, designed to wound. Born of lust and deception, carrying tainted blood that no amount of legitimization can purify. You speak of this creature as though it matters, as though it deserves consideration equal to your duties and obligations. Enough. James rose from his chair, his patience finally exhausted. You will not speak of my child that way, not today, not ever again. James. No, Mother. You have had your say. You have explained your position, made your threats, deployed your spiritual ally. He cast a contemptuous glance at Father Benedict, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And now you will hear mine. He moved to the window, looking out at the winter landscape that stretched beyond the castle walls, the frozen fields, the bare trees, the distant hills where sheep huddled against the cold. This land had belonged to Ashworths for 5 generations. His great-great-grandfather had built the first stone tower on this site, had defended it against Welsh raiders and jealous neighbors and the chaos of civil war. His grandfather had expanded the holdings, had earned the title of duke through loyal service to the crown. His father had consolidated the power, had made the Ashworth name synonymous with influence and wealth. And now James would either continue that legacy on his own terms or watch it crumble because he had dared to love a woman his mother had not chosen for him. I will marry Eleanor Whitmore, he said, his voice steady as bedrock. I will acknowledge our child as my legitimate heir. I will face whatever consequences those decisions bring, the broken betrothal, the scandal, the loss of position at court. I will do these things because they are right, because I gave my heart and my word to a woman who deserved better than the cruelty this family showed her, and because no amount of power or wealth or social standing is worth the price of abandoning those I love. He turned to face his mother, and something in his expression made her recoil slightly, as though she had finally recognized that the boy she had always managed had become a man she could no longer control. You may disinherit me if you wish. You may strip me of the Ashworth name and banish me from these lands. But you cannot make me abandon Eleanor, and you cannot make me pretend that our child does not exist. Those choices are beyond your power to compel. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with implications neither fully understood. Lady Margaret stared at her son as though seeing a stranger, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking to reveal the fear beneath. Fear of change, of loss, of a future she had not planned and could not control. Father Benedict cleared his throat. My son, surely there is a middle path. There is no middle path. James cut him off without ceremony. There is Eleanor, and there is everything else. I have made my choice. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the iron ring. I will inform Lady Charlotte and her father of the broken betrothal myself. I owe them that much honesty, even if this family has shown precious little of it to anyone. James. His mother's voice stopped him, rough with emotions she could not quite suppress. If you do this, there will be no returning, no reconciliation. You will have declared yourself against your own blood. No, Mother. James looked back at her, and for the first time she saw not anger in his eyes, but something worse, something like pity. I will have declared myself in favor of a different kind of family, one built on love instead of alliance, on truth instead of manipulation, on the radical notion that every person's worth should be judged by their character rather than their birth. He opened the door and stepped through, leaving his mother and her chaplain in the cold, gray light of a winter morning that suddenly seemed very long indeed. The news spread through the castle like fire through dry straw, and from the castle to the village, and from the village to the great houses of the realm. Within 3 days of Eleanor's return, every noble household within a week's ride hummed with speculation and scandal. The Ashworth governess, dismissed in disgrace, rumored to have fled with stolen silver or bewitched the air with dark magic or any of a dozen other fictions that Lady Margaret had carefully cultivated, had reappeared at the castle. She had been seen walking the frozen gardens with Lord James himself, her hand resting on his arm, her condition impossible to conceal beneath her winter cloak. The betrothal to Lady Charlotte Sinclair hung in the balance like a sword suspended by a thread. The Ashworth dynasty trembled on the edge of transformation or destruction. For those who had always resented the family's wealth and influence, the scandal was delicious vindication, proof that even the mighty could fall when passion overcame prudence. For those who depended on Ashworth patronage and protection, it was terrifying uncertainty, a harbinger of changes that might sweep away the stable order they had known. And for Lady Charlotte Sinclair herself, beautiful, accomplished, raised from birth to be the Duchess of Ashworth, it was a devastation she was too well bred to show in public, though her private tears had reportedly soaked through a dozen fine linen handkerchiefs. Eleanor learned of Charlotte's response from Marjorie, the head cook who had served the Ashworth family for 20 years and who remembered with particular fondness a young governess who had always found time to visit the kitchens and praise the bread. "She came to the castle yesterday," Marjorie reported, settling into the chair Eleanor had offered in her chamber. The older woman's face was lined with the weariness of a household divided against itself, but her eyes held sympathy and something that might have been respect. "Lady Charlotte, I mean. She asked to speak with Lord James, but he was riding the estate boundaries, so she spoke with Lady Margaret instead." "What happened?" "I cannot say for certain. I was not present in the solar, but I saw Lady Charlotte depart." Marjorie paused, her work-roughened hands twisting in her lap. "She was weeping, mistress. Not the delicate tears one sees in noble ladies performing grief, but real tears, the kind that come from genuine heartbreak. And she looked at the castle as she entered her carriage. Looked at it the way one looks at a place where something precious has been lost forever." Eleanor felt a twist of guilt in her chest, sharp as a needle-piercing cloth. She had not asked James to betray his betrothal. She had not schemed to destroy another woman's happiness, but the outcome was the same regardless of intent. Charlotte Sinclair had spent months preparing for a wedding that would never happen, dreaming of a future that had crumbled the moment Eleanor stepped through the castle gates. "I never meant to cause her pain," Eleanor said quietly. "I know you did not, mistress." Marjorie reached out and patted her hand with the familiar comfort of a woman who had comforted many in her years of service. "And for what it is worth, I do not believe Lord James meant to cause her pain either. The betrothal was Lady Margaret's arrangement, not his heart's desire. Lady Charlotte deserves better than a husband who loves another, though I imagine that is cold comfort to her now." Cold comfort indeed. Eleanor had spent enough time in the shadows of privilege to understand how thoroughly Charlotte's life had been upended by these events. A broken betrothal was more than a social embarrassment. It was a permanent mark on a woman's reputation, a signal to future suitors that something must be wrong with her, that she had been found wanting by a man who should have been grateful for her hand. Charlotte would recover. She was young, beautiful, wealthy, connected to powerful families. But the recovery would take years and would leave scars that might never fully fade. "Marjorie," Eleanor said, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, mistress." "Why are you being kind to me? You must know that your position here depends on Lady Margaret's favor, and she has made her feelings about my presence abundantly clear to everyone in the household." The cook was silent for a moment, considering the question with the careful thoughtfulness that had made her invaluable to the household for 2 decades. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and experience. "When you were governess here," she said finally, "you treated the servants like people, not inferiors to be managed, not furniture to be ignored, but actual human beings with names and stories and feelings of our own. Do you remember young Bess, the scullery maid? You taught her to write her name because you saw how ashamed she was of marking documents with an X. And old Martin, the stable hand, you gave him herbs from the physic garden for his aching joints because you noticed he was in pain. Eleanor did remember. Small kindnesses, unremarkable at the time, offered simply because they had seemed right, because suffering should be eased when one had the power to ease it. The servants remember, Marjorie continued, her voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. We see everything, mistress, and we are expected to say nothing. But we remember. We remember who is kind and who is cruel, who treats us as people and who treats us as tools. And when someone who showed us kindness returns to fight for her place in this household, she met Eleanor's gaze with unexpected fierceness. We do not easily abandon her. The words settled into Eleanor's heart like seeds in fertile soil. She had felt so isolated in her return, a single woman against the full weight of the Ashworth establishment. But she was not as alone as she had believed. The household itself, the invisible army of workers who kept the castle running, held memories and loyalties that Lady Margaret could not entirely control. Thank you, Eleanor said, her voice rough with emotion she could not quite conceal. I cannot tell you what that means to me. You do not need to tell me, mistress. Just keep being the person you have always been. Marjorie rose from her chair, smoothing her apron with practiced hands. Now, Lord James asked me to tell you that he will return from his ride by the noon hour, and he would like you to meet him in the library. Something about documents and plans and making arrangements official. Documents, plans, official arrangements. The words seemed impossible, dreams from a world where women like Eleanor married men like James and society simply accepted it. But perhaps, Eleanor thought as Marjorie departed with a final sympathetic smile, perhaps the world was stranger than she had believed. Perhaps love could sometimes triumph against the odds. She spent the intervening hours in quiet preparation, choosing a gown that was modest but flattering, arranging her hair in a style that suggested neither servility nor presumption. The woman in the polished silver mirror looked tired but resolute, a woman who had survived 8 months of poverty and uncertainty and was ready to face whatever came next with dignity and tact. At the noon hour precisely, she descended to the library. James was waiting for her, but he was not alone. Beside him stood a man she did not recognize, middle-aged, soberly dressed in the dark robes of a legal clerk, carrying a leather satchel that suggested professional purpose. And in the chairs by the great fireplace, watching with expressions of carefully concealed interest, sat 2 people Eleanor had never expected to see in the same room. Lady Margaret Ashworth and another woman, silver-haired, elegantly dressed, with the sharp features and piercing eyes of a hunting falcon. Eleanor! James crossed the chamber to meet her, taking her hands in his with a warmth that seemed to fill the cold stone space around them. Thank you for coming. Allow me to present Master William Hartley, our family's legal counselor, and... He hesitated for just a moment. Lady Isabel Sinclair, the Countess of Westmore, Lady Charlotte's mother. Eleanor's heart stuttered like a candle flame in wind. Charlotte's mother. The woman whose daughter James had been promised to, here in this very room, watching her with eyes that held neither warmth nor welcome. Lady Sinclair. Eleanor managed a careful curtsy. I am honored to meet you, though I wish the circumstances were different. Lady Isabel's expression did not change. Mistress Whitmore, I have heard a great deal about you. Not all of it true, I imagine. Very little of it, from what my daughter has told me. Lady Isabel's voice was cool but not cruel, measured rather than hostile. Charlotte spoke with you several times during your employment here, did she not? She found you intelligent, well-read, and surprisingly refined for a woman of your origins. Lady Charlotte was always kind to me. She was, and she is devastated now, as I am certain you can imagine. Lady Isabel rose from her chair and approached Eleanor with the measured steps of a woman who never moved without purpose. I did not come here to curse you or threaten you, Mistress Whitmore. That is Lady Margaret's approach, and we have already seen how well it has succeeded. I came because I wish to understand something before I decide how to proceed. What do you wish to understand? Whether you love him. Lady Isabel's gaze was penetrating, cutting through pretense with the skill of a woman who had navigated noble society for decades. Not whether you desire his wealth or his name or the elevation that marriage would provide. I wish to know if you love James Ashworth, the man, with all his flaws and complications, well enough to sacrifice everything for him. Because if you do not, if this is a scheme or a manipulation or simply the desperate act of a woman with no other path, then I shall use every resource at my disposal to destroy you. Not from cruelty, but from protection for my daughter, who deserves better than to lose her future to a fraud." The chamber was utterly silent. Lady Margaret's face showed surprise. She had not expected this approach from her former ally. James looked as though he wanted to intervene, but was holding himself back, understanding that this was Eleanor's moment to prove herself. Eleanor met Lady Isabel's gaze without wavering. "I love him," she said simply. "I have loved him since the night he read Chaucer aloud in this very library, and asked me whether I believed that souls could recognize their true companions across all barriers of birth and station. I loved him when I had nothing to gain from it and everything to lose. I loved him through 8 months of silence and poverty, believing he had abandoned me, unable to cease loving him even when I wished with all my heart that I could." She placed her hand on her abdomen. "And I love the future we have created together, the proof that what we shared was real and lasting and worth fighting for." She stepped closer to Lady Isabel, close enough to see the fine lines around the older woman's eyes, the silver threads in her carefully arranged hair. "I am sorry for what this has cost your daughter. Truly, deeply sorry. She did nothing to deserve this pain. But I cannot sacrifice my own happiness and my child's future to spare Lady Charlotte's feelings, any more than you would sacrifice your daughter's happiness to spare mine." Eleanor's voice was steady now, filled with conviction. "We are both mothers now, or I shall be soon. Surely you understand what that means." For a long moment, Lady Isabel said nothing. Then slowly, something shifted in her expression, not quite softening, but acknowledging a worthy opponent where she had expected to find easy prey. "Yes," she said finally. "I understand." She turned to Lady Margaret, and her voice took on a different quality, harder, more businesslike. "Margaret, I came here believing that I would find a schemer and a manipulator, someone I could easily expose and destroy. Instead, I find a woman who speaks of love with the conviction of genuine feeling and faces this room without flinching." Lady Isabel's smile was thin, but not entirely unkind. "I withdraw my opposition to this union. The betrothal between James and Charlotte is ended, and I shall not pursue consequences beyond that natural conclusion." Lady Margaret's face went white with fury. "Isabel, you cannot—" "I can, and I have. My daughter's heart is broken, but it shall mend. Better a broken heart now than a loveless marriage to a man who adores someone else." Lady Isabel gathered her cloak. "Charlotte shall find another match. A better match, perhaps, one that does not come with quite so much drama. In the meantime, I suggest you accept the inevitable with whatever grace you can muster, Margaret. Your son has made his choice. Fighting it shall only exhaust you." She paused at the door and looked back at Eleanor one final time. "Take care of him, Mistress Whitmore. He shall need someone strong beside him in the years to come." Then she was gone, leaving a silence that rang with the absence of the opposition Lady Margaret had counted upon. The weeks that followed brought a slow, painful transformation to Ashworth Castle. Lady Margaret did not surrender gracefully. That was not in her nature. But without the Sinclair alliance to bolster her position, her threats carried less weight, her ultimatums less force. She retreated into cold civility, speaking to Eleanor only when necessary, treating her son with the wounded formality of a mother who felt herself betrayed. But even stone walls can be worn down by persistent water, and Eleanor's presence in the household was nothing if not persistent. She did not demand acceptance. She simply existed, quietly and steadily, helping where she could, treating even those who despised her with unfailing courtesy. She visited the servants' quarters and remembered their names. She walked the grounds with James and let the household see that their love was not scandal, but simply love. Two people who had found each other against impossible odds. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. It was the child that finally broke through Lady Margaret's defenses. Eleanor's labor began on a spring morning when the apple trees in the orchard were heavy with blossoms and the world seemed full of new beginnings. It was long and difficult, 14 hours of pain that left her exhausted and trembling. But when it was over, when the midwife placed the squalling infant in her arms, Eleanor looked down at her daughter's face and felt something shift in the universe, some fundamental reordering of everything that mattered. "She is beautiful," James whispered, his voice rough with emotion as he knelt beside the bed. "She has your eyes. And your stubbornness, I suspect." Eleanor smiled weakly. "What shall we call her?" "Hope." The voice came from the doorway, unexpected and shocking in its familiarity. Lady Margaret stood at the threshold, her face unreadable, her hands clasped before her. She had not entered Eleanor's chamber since the return, had maintained her distance with the rigid discipline of a woman who would rather suffer alone than admit defeat. But now she stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the infant in Eleanor's arms. "Hope," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because that is what she represents. A new beginning. A chance for this family to become something other than what we have been." She stopped beside the bed, and for a long moment, grandmother and grandchild regarded each other. The old woman who had spent her life building walls, the infant who knew nothing of walls or the reasons they were built. "May I?" Lady Margaret's voice cracked slightly, revealing emotions she had spent months suppressing. "May I hold her?" Eleanor looked at James, saw the hope warring with caution in his eyes, and made a decision that felt like forgiveness. "Of course," she said, and placed her daughter in her grandmother's arms. Lady Margaret held the child with the careful tenderness of someone handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. A tear traced down her cheek, the first sign of vulnerability Eleanor had ever witnessed in her. "I was wrong," Lady Margaret said quietly, her eyes never leaving her grandchild's face. "About you. About what love means. About so many things." She looked up at Eleanor, and for the first time there was no hostility in her gaze, only exhaustion and something that might eventually become acceptance. "I do not know how to apologize for what I did to you. I do not know if such an apology is even possible." "It is," Eleanor replied softly. "And it begins with this moment. With you, here, holding our daughter. With choosing to be part of her life instead of fighting against it." Lady Margaret nodded slowly, as though accepting a burden she had long resisted. "I cannot promise to change overnight. I cannot promise that the old habits will not resurface, that I will not struggle against instincts I have spent a lifetime cultivating. I do not ask for overnight transformation. I ask only for effort, for the willingness to try." "That," Lady Margaret said, looking down at baby Hope with something like wonder, "I can promise. Frozen, if this moment of reconciliation touched your heart, leave a comment with the words, 'Love heals all wounds.' Let me know that you felt the power of forgiveness in this story." 1 year later, spring returned to Ashworth Castle with the riot of color that comes after a hard winter. Gardens erupting into bloom, the hills turning from brown to brilliant green, the whole world awakening from its long sleep. Eleanor stood at the window of the chamber that had become her own, watching James walk through the orchard with Hope in his arms, pointing at the apple blossoms and laughing at whatever baby sounds she made in response. The sight filled her with a contentment so profound it sometimes frightened her, as though such happiness could not possibly last, could not possibly be real. But it was real. Against all odds, against every obstacle that had been placed in their path, it was real. The wedding had taken place in the castle chapel on a December morning, simple and quiet, witnessed only by household staff and a few loyal friends who had braved social disapproval to attend. Eleanor had worn a gown of deep blue velvet, not white, for she had no pretense of innocence to maintain, and not the elaborate confection that a duke's bride might typically wear, but something beautiful and dignified and entirely her own. James had looked at her as she walked toward him down the chapel aisle, and his expression had held such love, such certainty, that she had nearly wept before reaching his side. They had spoken their vows in voices that did not waver, had exchanged rings that had belonged to James's grandmother, had sealed their union with a kiss that promised everything and demanded nothing but the truth they had already proven. And then they had begun the slow work of building a life together. It had not been easy. Society had not simply accepted their marriage. There had been whispered scandals and withdrawn invitations, former friends who suddenly found themselves too busy to call. The great families of the realm had largely closed their doors to the duke who had married his governess. the woman who had risen above her station through love rather than proper arrangement. But Eleanor had discovered something surprising in that social exile. She did not miss the world that had rejected her. The endless rounds of formal visits, the careful conversations laden with hidden meanings, the constant performance of worthiness, none of it had ever brought her joy. What brought her joy was this: James reading poetry aloud while she nursed their daughter. Hope's first smile, her first laugh, her first stumbling steps across the chamber floor, the household staff gathering for celebrations that ignored rank and station, Lady Margaret slowly thawing, learning to be a grandmother rather than a general. The reconciliation with her mother-in-law had been the most unexpected gift of the past year. Lady Margaret had not transformed overnight. That was too much to ask of anyone, but she had genuinely tried. She visited the nursery daily, cooing at Hope with a tenderness that seemed to surprise even herself. She began to take meals with James and Eleanor, the conversation initially stilted but gradually warming. She even, on one memorable occasion, apologized directly to Eleanor for the cruelty of her initial dismissal. "I was afraid," Lady Margaret had admitted, her voice rough with the effort of confession. "Afraid of change, afraid of losing control, afraid of what would happen to this family if the old structures collapsed. I convinced myself that I was protecting James when I was really protecting my own certainty." She had reached across the table and taken Eleanor's hand, the first truly voluntary contact between them. "You have shown me that change does not have to mean destruction, that new foundations can be built when old ones crumble." Now, watching her husband and daughter in the orchard, Eleanor reflected on how far they had all come. The castle that had once felt like a fortress of hostility had become a home. The family that had tried to destroy her had become her own. The future that had seemed impossible was unfolding before her, ordinary and miraculous at once. James looked up and saw her at the window. His smile was the same one that had first broken through her professional reserve when she was merely the governess, and he was merely the heir to a fortune she would never share. Open, genuine, full of a love that had survived everything thrown against it. He shifted Hope to one arm and waved for Eleanor to join them. She did not hesitate. She descended the stairs and walked through the great hall and emerged into the spring sunshine, crossing the lawn to where her husband and daughter waited among the apple blossoms. James pulled her close with his free arm, and for a moment, the three of them stood together in the dappled light, a family forged in struggle and sustained by choice. "Happy?" James asked softly. Eleanor looked at her daughter's face, round and rosy and perfect. She looked at her husband's eyes, still carrying the shadows of past pain, but bright now with present joy. She looked at the castle behind them, gray stone softened by climbing roses, and at the orchard around them, fragrant with the promise of fruit to come. "Yes," she said, "completely." It was not a fairy tale ending. Life never provided those, not really. There would be challenges ahead, struggles they could not yet imagine, sorrows that would test the love they had built. Lady Margaret would have difficult days when old habits resurfaced. Society would continue its whispers. The world would not simply forget that Eleanor had been cast aside as unworthy before returning to claim everything. But she had learned something in the past 2 years, something that felt like wisdom earned through suffering. Happiness was not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of love sufficient to face it. She had that love. She had James and Hope and a family that had chosen her just as she had chosen them. She had come to these gates with nothing but her courage and her truth. She would remain with everything that mattered. The library at Ashworth Castle had been transformed. Where once dark corners had gathered shadows and silence, now sunlight streamed through enlarged windows, illuminating shelves that held not only the ancient tomes of previous generations, but new books as well. Books for children, books about the wider world, books that Eleanor had selected herself to educate young minds about possibility rather than limitation. Hope, now 5 years old, sat on a bright cushion surrounded by her lessons, her dark hair, so like her father's, falling across her face as she concentrated on forming letters with careful determination. Beside her, her younger brother William, named for Eleanor's father, a tenant farmer who had died before she was old enough to remember him, played with wooden blocks, occasionally demanding his sister's attention with the imperious certainty of a 3-year-old who knows himself to be the center of the universe. Eleanor watched them from her chair by the fire, her hands resting on the swell of her abdomen where a third child grew, and felt the peculiar contentment that came from witnessing ordinary moments that had once seemed impossible. James entered the library carrying a letter, his face thoughtful. "News from court," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "The king has invited us to the Christmas celebrations. Formally, with honors." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "After 5 years of pretending we do not exist? It seems our existence has become difficult to ignore. The schools we've established have educated 300 children. The tenant reforms have doubled crop yields across the estate. The merchants we've partnered with speak well of our fairness." James smiled, the expression carrying echoes of the young man who had once quoted Whitman to a governess in this very room. Apparently, scandal fades when success persists. "And Lady Margaret? What does she think of this royal attention?" "She is, I believe, already planning what gown she will wear." James's smile widened. "She mentioned something about showing those court peacocks what true dignity looks like." Eleanor laughed, a sound that still sometimes surprised her after so many years of guarding her emotions. Lady Margaret had transformed in ways none of them could have predicted. The Iron Matriarch had softened into a devoted grandmother, fierce in her protection of Hope and William, proud of the family they had all built together. She still had difficult moments, still sometimes retreated into old patterns of control and manipulation, but she always found her way back, drawn by love she had once denied herself permission to feel. "Mama?" Hope looked up from her letters, her expression serious. "Grandmother says I must learn to curtsy properly before we meet the king. But I think curtsying is silly. Why must I bow to someone just because he was born with a crown?" Eleanor exchanged a glance with James, seeing her own beliefs reflected in their daughter's innocent rebellion. They had raised their children to question, to think, to judge people by their actions rather than their titles. It was a dangerous education for nobles to provide, perhaps, but it was honest. "You must curtsy," Eleanor said carefully, "because courtesy costs nothing and opens doors that rudeness closes. But you are right that birth does not determine worth. The king deserves respect for his position, but admiration must be earned through deeds, not inherited through blood." Hope considered this with the gravity of a natural philosopher examining a new specimen. "Like you," she said finally. "You were not born a duchess, you became one through deeds." Something like that. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, not of sadness but of pride, of gratitude for this child who understood, even at 5, the lessons that had taken Eleanor a lifetime to learn. James reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "We have built something remarkable," he said quietly. "Not just this family, but this way of being. Children who question, servants who are treated as people, a household that values truth over pretense. We built it together." "Yes." He raised her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. "Together." Outside the library windows, the summer afternoon stretched golden and warm across the castle grounds. In the orchard, apple trees heavy with fruit swayed in a gentle breeze. In the village beyond the walls, children who had learned their letters in Ashworth schools played in the lanes, their futures broader than their parents had dared to dream. And in the great hall, Lady Margaret was probably already terrorizing the seamstresses about her court gown, channeling her formidable energy into the new battles she had chosen to fight. Eleanor looked around the library, at her children, her husband, the life they had created from the wreckage of rejection and despair, and allowed herself to feel, fully and without reservation, the magnitude of what they had achieved. She had been cast aside as unworthy. She had returned wearing the Duke's future. And now, 5 years later, that future had become the present, ordinary and extraordinary, difficult and beautiful, everything she had never dared to hope for, and more than she had ever dreamed she deserved. This was her life, her family, her home. And she would protect it, nurture it, and love it for all the years that remained to her, with the same fierce determination that had carried her through the gates of Ashworth Castle on that winter day so long ago. Some stories end with happiness. This one continued with it.